Cristina Banfi, thank you so much for taking the time this busy morning for you and these busy, interesting days that we're living. I'm really appreciative. I was looking at the context that Argentina is living. Well, you know how Argentina has been portrayed unfavorably oftentimes here and there. But then you look at Argentina today dealing with these pandemics, and it seems like you are doing remarkably well comparatively. It's a very difficult decision. The numbers are looking much better than many other nations that are claiming to have all kinds of resources and whatnot. And I think that might be because of the solidarity that I found and I perceived when I was fortunate to visit your place not so long ago. So thank you for taking the time. And I would love to talk to hear about your experience with as an educator coping with the COVID. Why don't we start, Cristina, with you telling us a little bit about your institutional context, the socioeconomic context of your students, and then a little bit about yourself and your trajectory as an instructor in the English language, right?
Yes, in English language education in general and education in languages as well. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me, Juan Jose. It's a pleasure to be able to share some of these experiences. And yes, you're right. Argentina has always been a bit of a bad boy, bad girl in the social in the world sphere, but we've been taken by surprise by the cautiousness and the concern with which measures have been taken, because we tend to be a little bit on the reckless side of things, and this time we appear not to be, and it appears to be showing in the positive results in figures, at least for the time being. Which is it's a good thing that measures were taken early, because there are a number of areas of concern, particularly in those areas where the most disadvantaged people live, where it's very difficult to take certain precautions, and those are the ones that are now seeing the greatest rise in numbers of infected people and people who are getting sick because of the living conditions. People live very much in proximity. It's very difficult to establish the hygiene conditions that are required. But on the other hand, we do have a fairly strong medical service that has been preparing over this time. We've had the advantage over the Northern Hemisphere of the forewarning of what was to come. So there was time to prepare, and there's still preparations going on. In any case, it is very tough, because for many people, they say about 30% of the population live in informal working conditions. So they work in industries or sectors where they don't get a salary if they stay at home. So that is very, very challenging. They have to go to work to get paid, and so it's the debate between the economy and the protection of individuals' health comes down to a very concrete level. It's not at the very high level in those cases. So it's very complicated.
So you hold a teaching and a research position, right, at the university?
That's right. I've said this in writing in some publications. We tend to wear many hats here, particularly in education. We've even coined a phrase of a taxi teacher who goes from one institution to the next within one day. Often in public transport, not taxis, really, right? And it's partly a problem with the way appointments work for teachers, but I try to see things, glass half full rather than half empty, and it does have certain beneficial aspects in that you tend to cross-pollinate the different contexts where you work, and what you learn in one place you take to another place, and so on and so forth. For many years I worked at the Ministry of Education, starting in 2007 in the city of Buenos Aires, and I was in charge of the department that deals with languages and language teaching, particularly additional languages and particularly English, but also French, Italian, Portuguese, German, and even Chinese, right? So I had, and we also incorporated in recent years, we changed the name. When I started working there, it was the Department of Foreign Languages, and then it became the Department of Additional Languages, and it became the Department of Languages and Education, because we were also charged with working with indigenous languages and with sign language. So it was everything that has to do with language policy, and in particular in education, right? But because of the many hats we wear, I also worked and continue working in teacher education at the university and at several teacher training colleges. And there I have the chance of working with undergraduates and postgraduate students who are in English and in other languages as well. And I get to see secondhand, if not firsthand, the reality of teaching languages in schools, because most of our students work while they study. This is a peculiarity of our higher education institutions, and they work in the jobs that they're training for. So it's quite different, let's say, from talking to students about the type of work they will be doing once they graduate.
As opposed to what you're doing.
As opposed to saying to them, you know, when you teach students in this context, tell me what happens, right? And so it has advantages and disadvantages. It means that students take much longer to graduate, because they may take up to 10 years to do a 4-year course. But it also means that we can take advantage of that experience and feed it into our work to get them to reflect on their. So it's a bit of a pre-service and in-service into one. It's quite interesting.
Well, you know, most of the training that people get in the real world is like that, is in the job training. So that's it sounds very much so like that. So fancy. So normally you teach in a classroom setting, right?
Absolutely. Normally we teach in a classroom setting with zero institutionally provided technology. I've taught in the States, and I remember back in the 90s, I had OHTs and projectors and things like that in every classroom. None of that. But in the last few years, I've started using technology as a supplement to my classes. So I created websites, and I haven't accepted work that was not digitally submitted for a decade, because I didn't want to use paper. So that allowed me to transition quite easily into this modality.
And
because I have
my students with you, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. But even last year, before all this happened, I was you know, lecturing and running workshops with students using all our material online. Okay, so I would upload files, and I would provide them with digital material, digital books, digital papers. Everything was digitalized. So for me, that bit wasn't really that much of a challenge, although I know that for many of my colleagues, it has been a huge headache. And that's, you know, it's been very complicated for them, because they've not only had to manage maybe video conferencing and learning all these new tools, but also, you know, generating a whole load of materials that they didn't have in digital.
They didn't have readily available. So what's the socioeconomic context of your institution? Is this a large institution, so that for those of us that are not familiar?
There's several institutions. One is the University of Buenos Aires, where I teach a postgraduate course. And there, the directive was to stop the teaching altogether. And postpone it. Yeah, I'd started a course that is taught on Saturdays in the MA in translation there. And the directive is restart June the 1st, which I don't think we will be able to, because even though many economic activities have been reopened as of Monday, education and classes appear not to restart, and they won't restart until maybe September.
Yeah, because this is the winter, right? For you.
Exactly. We're
So you
coming up
normally
to
have
the cold weather.
you have a winter break these days, or
In July.
in July?
In July, we have 2 weeks.
There was a major disruption because you're not done with the.
Absolutely.
Wow.
We've barely started. In most cases, we started online. So, for example, my daughter is 16. She never met her teachers. She's met them online. My son is 12. He's in the final year of primary school, and he barely had a week. And I've started some other courses I teach at the undergraduate level, and I met my students on video conferencing, and some of them I won't be meeting in person because the first term will finish in July. And the big debate now is what happens with assessment and with evaluation of these students, because there's been a general directive for schools from the National Ministry of Education not to grade students.
Okay.
So there will be a kind of conceptual assessment, but no grading. And that poses all sorts of problems, and that's generated a debate. It has to do with the different levels of accessibility that students have, and connectivity and possibility to get the work. And in some contexts, private schools are doing video conferencing for every subject, or for pretty much every subject. State schools are using email, WhatsApp. Some are starting some video conferencing. In some cases, it's been left up to the individual teacher to decide what tool they choose to use and what works for them, which is good and bad because it means there's huge, in some of the institutions where I teach, lecturers have, professors have told their students to take the course next term. So,
but the concern is that a substantial proportion of your student body might be left behind and unattended because of lack of access. No.
Personally, my students, everyone that was enrolled has been attending, and attendance is better than it would normally be in person, because there's no transportation issues, because everyone is at home anyway, because they'd allocated those slots to. So, I had a class yesterday, 32 students, 31 students were there. One sent me a message saying she was having a problem with her computer. But they've been there consistently. Remarkable, absolutely. I think that part of the issue there is that I established that I would teach the classes in the allocated time for the allocated period, and I'm there every time, and I expect them to be, and I start the class on time. And that's not been the case in every situation. Sometimes people choose to rearrange the time and change the slot and that. And of course, I don't have first-year students. That's another advantage, right? My students are second-year students in my groups. I teach second years or fourth years, and so they already are into the rhythm and they know how things work, and so it's different in that respect. I suspect that first-year students, but my husband teaches first-year students at some of the same institutions, and he's amazed at the level of participation and responsiveness. And he was particularly pleased when he created breakout rooms. And he found that the students who in the big group wouldn't talk started talking, and he couldn't stop them because there was such a, I mean, these are all adults, right? But they had so much they needed to communicate, he found, and they needed to engage with the other students that they've never met because they're first year students.
So for what I gather, Cristina, you have all the range of social strata in your courses, right?
Yes and no. There is some level of social selection anyway. The courses are free. Higher education is free in Argentina, not postgraduate, but undergraduate. Which means that that's not an issue. However, English language education, because there's an entrance exam and there's a requirement of English language proficiency, it tends to have a bit of a more selective population, i.e. most students have studied English privately. They've either attended private schools or language schools that are complementary to schools. So there is a level of selection. Another place where I work, and again, the multiple hats, sorry for the I've been advising and working with a private language institute, right? And that there's a large network of these institutes that teach languages extracurricularly, right? And these are schools that function in the evenings mostly, that teach children, teenagers, and adults, and that this particular one has 15 different sites in the city and the suburbs and has 8,000 students. So we're talking a large organization.
Yeah.
Now, for them, it was vital to go digital virtually overnight. In a week, all the students that didn't have user IDs and didn't have, they had to have them, because it's a question of economic survival. If they don't provide the service, they don't get paid.
Yeah, yeah.
And they, interestingly, there is a range there, because even though it's a fee-paying organized institution, they do get a range of students from the more affluent to the least affluent. And so we find, for example, that in some cases students don't want to show where they live.
Yeah.
And are using cell phones because they don't have computers, or using, they have to, there's issues with families with more than one kid because they only have one device.
Exactly.
And that is clearly happening we did have a one laptop per child program in state schools in the city of Buenos Aires and in the national government for secondary schools too, but the coverage is not 100%, and that happened a while ago, and some of the computers have broken down, and so there are issues with accessibility to technology. That's definitely an issue.
Cristina, I want, before we close the interview, because it should be short, I'd like to steal 2 or 3 more minutes, because I'd like to get a little bit of your perspective as to, I don't know how you see things, but the way I see it, and the way some of our colleagues in all over the world are seeing this, we're not going back to where we were. It's going to be a new normal. We need to really change things. So as a pedagogist, as an educator, what are the things that you don't want to miss when we go back to that new normal? And what are the things that need to change so that we can be better prepared for another eventuality?
Well, they're talking about going back to schools, for example, 2-3 days a week or less. So I think that what's happened basically is that we've been talking about incorporating technology to improve education for a long time. And out of all the talk, if there was an impact of 10%, I think that was a lot. This has made us go from that 10% to 100%. All of a sudden, right? Whether you like it or not, whether you like technology or not, people have had to do it, right? And I think it's shown the possibilities, and it's shown the fact that we don't need to all, move around the city and travel miles every day to get from A to B, and that we can do things in a different way. It is possible to be educated in a different way. It is possible to have access to teachers and to education and to content and to interaction and to learning in a different way. We've had to think classes differently. We've had to think, okay, I'm going to assign some work to students. They're going to do it at home. Then they're going to come back. We're going to talk the flipped classroom idea that everybody talked about and nobody did. Now is happening. And we shouldn't lose that. We shouldn't try to go back to the old normal. Yeah. I think some things of the new normal are good. And I like teaching from home. I like to go and meet the students in person and have some in-person interactions. But this idea that we have to, sit in a place for hours just to fill a slot, it really doesn't make sense, right? But I'm not sure how much people are thinking about this sort of thing.
Yeah.
That's what worries me, because and that's where we go back to the beginning of the conversation, where Argentina is the bit of the bad boy or girl in the world scene. We tend not to plan for the long term. We tend to sort out the contingency, and we've survived so many contingencies that this one we seem to be doing in a better way. But I'm not
think
sure.
it's impressive. I think it's impressive, yeah.
We are surprised, to tell you the truth. But what I worry is not about the short term or even the medium term. I worry about the long term. And I wonder how many people are thinking about that. And I wish more people were asking these sorts of questions, because I think this will pass. And now it seems like a big deal, but maybe even if it's 2 years of normality, but then what? Things have to be different.
Exactly. Fantastic. Cristina, well, thank you very much. I don't want to close without telling you that I miss two things of Buenos Aires, particularly. One is the good food, but your libraries, your bookstores. It's just don't lose
You're welcome to come and visit whenever it's possible to do that. But interestingly, I'll give you an interesting turn on that fact. We have fabulous bookstores. We have fabulous places where you can buy books. We don't have such wonderful public libraries. And we don't have such wonderful academic libraries. In fact, one of the things that I did when I went digital was I created a digital library for my students, because the books that they had in the places where I teach are the books that I used as a student.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
And there's no budget for that. So there's an issue with copyright. And if people are going to think long term, people are going to have to think long term about copyright and about access to knowledge and open access and all these open data ideas that people are talking about, and think about them differently for the first world and for the third world, because we may be whatever unusual world we think we're in Argentina, but in that respect, we're more third world than anything else. And it's a big limitation when you're teaching. Some cases with the help of pirates in Russia.
Oh my goodness.
The people, when you try to get digital books, the place where my students find them for me is websites that the Russians have set up that are pirating sites. It's awful.
Isn't that something?
The books are not even here in the bookshops. I can't even buy them if I want to. I used to buy books when I traveled and come home with suitcases full of books. But then for the students to have them, they'd have to be photocopied. And we have massive photocopy shops where this would be done. Now it's digital.
Now it's... Okay, well, good to hear that the Russians are contributing to expansion.
Something.
Cristina, I know you have a very busy day. I'm really thankful for your time. And
thank you so much. And sorry about the Russian. If there's any other things that you want to know, I'm here.
Our heart goes to you and all the Argentinians, and we're learning from whatever you're doing, which is mutual, in solidarity, and it is wonderful to see how you're coping with it. So
I look forward to seeing you here when we can travel.
That'd be lovely.
Welcoming you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.